What we're going to do in this video is try to understand a little bit, in a little bit more detail, what exactly Locke thinks about the divine law or the law of nature. And to do that, we're going to turn to the second treatise of government, where he discusses the law of nature at a little bit greater length. The law of nature, recall, just is the divine law. It's the same thing. There are passing references to this law in the essay, but the second treatise of government is more concerned with it. Now, there's a lot of other things going on in the second treatise of government that we're not really going to pay that much attention to, that are very interesting, but it's more for a political philosophy class, not for ethics. We're just really trying to understand this law of nature and what it commands and so on. All right, so Locke kind of tells a story in the second treatise of government, a story about how political communities arose. And this story that he tells, it has a lot of import for political theory and how we're supposed to understand the legitimacy of the state and so on. That's not what we're going to focus on. But we do need to understand some of this story to understand where he's coming from, to understand what's going on. And so the story he tells is that human beings originally were not in a political community. There was a kind of original natural state of humanity, a pre-political state of humanity. And then human beings chose to enter into a political community, right? That's the story Locke is telling. And this story has enormous influence on the founders, but also on philosophy more generally. You find something like this story, for instance, in the background of Judith Jarvis Thomson's view of rights and view of obligations. Judith Jarvis Thomson, if you'll recall, she says that being a mother does not mean that you have any particular or special responsibility to care for your child or care for the fetus, right? The biological relationship doesn't entail a special responsibility. Rather, a special responsibility has to be like voluntarily or consciously accepted. Something like that idea is back here in Locke. Locke influences that idea. The idea being human beings are these kind of isolated individuals, and then they choose to enter into communities or relationships with people. And when they do that, well, then maybe certain obligations towards those people arise, right? That's kind of what Locke is doing. What Locke wants to say is, in this pre-political state, before any political community, just individuals running around in a state of nature, he says people in that state have perfect freedom. They may use their stuff however they see fit to. They can kind of do whatever they want. It's not, however, a state of license. You can't do absolutely whatever you want. Rather, you are constrained by the law of nature. And so what Locke means in saying that the state of nature is not a state of license, he means that there is a moral law that's binding on you. There are no governmental laws. There's no law of the United States. There's no international laws or anything like that. There's no city ordinances. There is, however, a moral law that still constrains you and binds you. It would still be wrong, even in a state of nature, no government, no anything like that. It would still be wrong to murder somebody. You're still constrained by the law of nature, by the moral law, right? And so this is why Locke kind of starts talking a little bit about the law of nature. It comes into play because it's always binding on human beings. The moral law is always binding on us. The law of nature is always binding on us. And that phrase, law of nature, that should immediately bring to mind Aquinas, because Aquinas talked about the natural law. And what we're going to see is that Locke's ideas on the law of nature in certain ways follow very closely what Aquinas is saying, but in other ways depart significantly, diverged significantly from Aquinas, right? But as far as it goes right now, similarities. Aquinas want to say the natural law binds everybody all the time, regardless of where they are, or what they, what their communal situation is, or anything like that. And Locke is saying the same thing. There's this law of nature. It's like a moral law. Aquinas would say something like that, right? The natural law is like a moral law. There's this moral law that's binding on everybody. Let's focus in now on this law of nature. It's binding on everybody. It obliges everybody. And Locke follows Aquinas further in saying that it's known by reason. In certain places, he says it simply is reason, or he'll say that it's self-evident, right? And that should bring to mind some of the kinds of things that we saw in Aquinas when he was talking about the natural law. Aquinas said the natural law was known per se, as it regards us and in its own right. It's known per se in both ways. It's kind of self-evident. The notion of this, the predicate is contained in the notion of the subject, right? He gave a kind of analysis of it, of what Aquinas did, of what it meant to say that it was self-evident. Now, Locke never gives an analysis of what he means in saying it's self-evident. And the way Locke uses that phrase, it seems like he's saying, look, the law of nature, it's self-evident, it's known by reason. You can just figure it out. You just kind of know it. Everybody just kind of knows it, right? It's obvious. That's as far as Locke kind of goes with it. Okay, but so far he's kind of following in step with Aquinas. And as I mentioned earlier, right, just to remind you again, though, this law of nature that he's discussing, that's the same thing as the divine law from the essay. And though Locke never uses the phrase, it's the moral law, something like that, right? And so here he's kind of departing from Aquinas. Aquinas would draw a sharp distinction between the natural law and the divine law. Locke said, no, it's the same thing. Runs them together. Well, okay, fine. What exactly does it tell us to do? What exactly are the commands of the law of nature? Locke kind of tangentially, it's never his main focus, but mentions a number of things. And in the first place, what he says, the first command of the law of nature is to preserve ourselves. And that, again, should call to mind Aquinas. The first natural inclination he mentions is the preservation of life. And so there's something about our natural instincts or something like that, that we're naturally geared to preserve our own lives. And Locke's picking up at that idea, saying the law of nature, the first command of the law of nature is to preserve ourselves. Now, Aquinas kind of situates the first precept, shows how you kind of get it from this notion of good, ties the notion of good into it. Yeah. And then turns to these natural inclinations, right? And so the command to preserve yourself is not the first precept, according to Aquinas. The first precept is do good and avoid evil. But Locke doesn't have as sophisticated a machinery that he's working with. And so he just says something like, well, look, the first command is, preserve yourselves. Don't commit suicide. Go get food when you're hungry and so on. The law of nature also commands us, according to Locke, not to harm anyone in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. And so that means, right, not to harm anyone in their life, don't murder people. Not to harm anyone in their health, don't attack or assault people. In their liberty, don't enslave people, and in their possessions, don't steal. Yeah. Now, one thing you might wonder is, well, why should we think this is what the law of nature tells us? We're going to look at some of what he wants to say about stealing in just a second. But in general, Locke's not going to say a whole lot in answer to that question. In contrast to Aquinas. Aquinas has quite a bit to say about why you ought not murder, or why, I put it this way, about why the natural law commands you not to murder. What would he say? He'd say, well, look, you've got the first precept, which is do good and avoid evil. Good is the first thing to fall within the purview of practical reason. and we know that you ought to do good and avoid evil. And then we got these natural inclinations, and these natural inclinations, our practical reason grasps these the objects of these natural inclinations as good, and their contraries as evil. And so you can plug those objects into that first precept. And one of our natural inclinations is to live in society. We're social beings, and so we know that we ought to do that. We ought to engage in pro-social behavior, and we ought to avoid antisocial behavior. We ought not murder our neighbor. That's the antisocial behavior to the extreme degree, right? And so Aquinas has this sophisticated framework involving natural inclinations and so on, to address a question like that. Why think the natural law says not to murder? But notice something. That framework involves the natural inclinations. It involves human nature. It involves this teleological conception of human beings. And so Locke can't avail himself of that. And so Locke, in the second treatise on government and everything he writes about the law of nature, is basically just left saying, well, I don't know, it's just self-evident. You shouldn't harm anybody in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. There's nothing else to say, really. He'll say some things here and there, and we're going to look at it with regard to stealing. He has a fairly sophisticated account of property, and so why stealing would be wrong. But these other things, and why not murder? I don't know, it's just self-evident, right? And so the rejection of teleology, we see the consequences of the rejection of teleology, right? It leaves a kind of less sophisticated system. So what you find in Locke is someone who's trying to take with him the what he would see as the promising parts of someone like Aquinas, while rejecting these parts that are connected to, or closely connected to, this teleological conception of the world. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that in rejecting that teleological conception, he's really rejecting a lot of the framework, a lot of the support, a lot of the justification. And so Locke is left just saying things like, well, it's self-evident, right? And so we get similarities to Aquinas. We see what he's taking on board, and we also see what he's rejecting and what the cost of that rejection is. Now, what I want to focus on is what he says about property. And this is chapter 5 of the Second Treatise on Government. This is probably the most famous part of the Treatise on Government. And in this section, Locke gives us an account of property that helps explain why stealing is wrong. And the account he gives is fairly sophisticated and hugely influential. And so let's try to understand what that account is. So his idea is going to be something like this. Locke thinks that we can have property even in the state of nature, that I can own things even if there's no government. Something could still be my property, and it'd be stealing if you took it, right? And so we don't have property merely because the government, says we do. We have property kind of naturally. We have a natural right to property. Well, how does that happen? How is it that you come to own something in the first place? I mean, it's understandable. Like, yeah, I got money and I give you money, and so, okay, fine. And then now I own the whatever cassette player you just sold me, fleeced me on. Fine, now I own that. But how do you come to own anything in the first place? That's what Locke gives an account of in chapter 5. He says something like this. Look, natural reason. So again, we get this kind of just appeal to reason, right? Just kind of self-evident, right? Natural reason tells us that people own their bodies. You own your body as your property. Your body is your property. Well, the labor or work of your body is therefore also your property, Locke would want to say, because the labor or work of your body is something your body does, and you own your body, so you own the work that your body does. So the work your body does is your property. Think of it like this. Say I'm in a state of nature, that's me walking along, and I come across a stick. And let's say I bend over to pick it up. And then I start working on it, right? For some reason, I have a knife with me in the state of nature. I suppose it'd be pretty handy. And I start whittling it. And I turn it into a spear, right? Locke's idea is that, well, look, I own my body and I own the work of my body. The work of my body is that. It's all that whittling. I own that energy or whatever, that laboring. And I've now put my work, my labor into that stick. My labor is in that stick, the thing that's now a spear. My labor, my work is in that. I've mixed my labor into it. And well, look, I own my labor because I own my body, and the labor is the labor of my body. And so something I own, my labor, has become inextricably mixed into the stick. Inextricably, why? Because I can't take my labor back out of the stick. It's in the stick, and it's in the stick for good. So something I own is now in that stick. And we're assuming that that stick wasn't owned by anybody. We're in a state of nature. Nobody has any property. It's in common, Locke would say, right? And now my labor is mixed into that resource. That's now my property, Locke would want to say. Why? Because something I own, namely my labor, is inextricably mixed into that stick. That makes it my property. When you work on an object, you mix your labor, which you own, into it. Your labor becomes inextricably mixed into it, and so it becomes your property. That's the idea that Locke has, right? And he would say that something as simple as picking up the stick is enough to make it your own. So if we go back, even right there, I just picked the stick up. That picking up of the stick is sufficient to make it mine. That was, that minimal labor, just picking it up or picking an apple off a tree or picking up a rock, whatever it might be, is sufficient to make it yours, right? And so the general idea he has, something like this. You take an unowned natural resource, which in our example is a stick, you add to it some amount of labor, whether that's whittling the stick or simply picking it up. That makes the thing your property. And so if you were to come around and then take my stick, right? So I whittle the thing into a stick and then you come and take it, that's theft. You're taking something that I have a rightful claim to, right? I mix something that I own with it. That thing is now my own. And so you ought not steal, right? You're taking something which is mine. I have a natural right to this. You would be violating that natural right to my stick were you to take it. And why do I have a natural right to it? Because my labor has been mixed into it. And I own my labor, right? Because I own my body. That's the account of property that Locke gives us. So that's a little bit more flesh, so to speak, that we can put on the bones of Locke's account of the law of nature. Locke uses this theory of property in a somewhat interesting way. So one of the other things that the law of nature commands is that we ought not murder people. And sometimes when Locke talks about that command, he just asserts it. He just says, well, look, it's just self-evident. You can just see that you ought not murder people. However, in one instance at least, Locke actually suggests something of an argument or a reason for it. And it depends upon this theory of property that he has. He gives an argument as to why you should not murder. What he says is something like this. We are all created by God, right? That's Locke's view. You might not agree with it. That's what Locke thinks. We're all created by God. Well, we're like the spear then, right? God made us. God mixed his labor into us, and so we are the property of God. All of us are. And so when you murder somebody, what you're doing is you are wrecking God's property. That's wrong. In a sense, that's a kind of theft. You're depriving God of his property. He has a rightful claim to that property to do with it as he sees fit, and you're depriving him of that property when you murder somebody. That's why you ought not murder, because we are the property of God, and you are wrecking. It is wrong to wreck somebody else's property, and so you ought not murder. Right? So he uses this theory of property in at least one instance to kind of support the prohibition on murder. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is the last part of the second treatise that we read, where Locke addresses why we should form a political community in the first place. And again, most of this discussion is going to be more relevant to political philosophy. But I want to focus on just one aspect as a kind of further comparison with Aquinas. In Locke's view, we are perfectly free in a state of nature. And so you might wonder, well, why would you give up that perfect freedom and join a political community? And Locke's answer to that is because your property and your person, for that matter, are very insecure in a state of nature. Most people, he says, are not strict observers of justice and equity. That's the way he puts it. Most people are degenerate and vicious, and so they're going to steal your stuff. And so you enter a political community to preserve your property, is what he says. And so the point of a political community is the mutual preservation of property. It's to defend it's a kind of useful thing that you use to defend yourself against people who would steal from you or kill you. That's the point of a political community, according to Locke. And so the laws of a political community are going to have as their goal the mutual preservation of property. We'll have laws that protect people in their life, liberty, and estate. We'll have laws that protect people and their property. That's what human laws should do, according to Locke. That and nothing else. To go beyond that would be illegitimate. And so here we see another contrast between Locke and Aquinas. For Aquinas, the human law was supposed to follow from the natural law. And both the human law and the natural law were ultimately aimed at human happiness, at the perfection of human nature, right? For Locke, it's not so. Human happiness, the perfection of our nature, making sure we live good lives, that has nothing to do with the political community. Or at the very least, the political community does not take that as its goal. The goal of the political community, the goal of human laws, is not the happiness of the citizens. It's merely to protect them in their life, liberty, and property. And while that might have some relationship to happiness, because you might say, well, look, you can't be happy unless you're secure in these things and so on. Nonetheless, human laws are not directly or explicitly aimed at happiness. They're not directly or explicitly aimed at the good, Locke would say, and Aquinas would say, at least on Locke's view. Aquinas would say that according to Locke's view, human laws, are not supposed to be aimed at the good. That's ridiculous, Aquinas would say, right? It's part of the essence of law that it be aimed at the good. But what we can see coming out here at the end of the second treatise on government, at the end of what we are reading from it, is this idea that human law really is not, it's supposed to be far more limited than Aquinas would allow for. Human law is not supposed to be concerned with the human good or with human happiness or anything like that. It's really just to protect you. It's a tool you use to protect you against people who would mess with you. And that's the end of it in Locke's view. That's as far as law should reach.